Call here a screen. There were actually a couple of changes that were made after I stepped off the committee that I'm not very happy with. And like in the image set, this particular object that we're going to be looking at next is titled a screen. And in the scholarship, it's known as a biombo, even in the English scholarship. And I wish they had used that term, biombo, instead of screen. So they made a couple of changes without my knowing after I stepped off, and I'm not happy. Two of the objects that are on here are not the ones I selected. Apparently the reason is that they weren't able to get copyright permission for these objects, so they substituted these, and I wish they had consulted with me because these are not, they're misrepresentative. And I'm talking about the shell inlay objects. There are two shell inlay objects, the virgin image and the screen, and these are not the objects that I wanted in the show. Shell inlay, although popular for a medium, was not dominant. But so in my presentation today, although this is what we have to work with, I did flesh it out by bringing in other examples of screens to kind of give you a better sense of what these objects really did look like, because the shell inlay screen is not representative of screens as a genre. In any case, when we talk about biombos, which were extremely popular, and as I mentioned several times earlier, when we talk about painting in the domestic space, the biombo becomes the primary vehicle, one of the primary vehicles for non-religious imagery. Okay, some of the terms that can be related to this is like decorative arts, working with the art historical nomenclature, furniture, the word screens, and then the original Japanese word that biombo is derived from, byobu. Biombo is a Hispanicized pronunciation of the Japanese term byobu. And this is the object, of course, that was replaced or put into the image set. There was another screen from the Denver Art Museum that would be very easy to get permission to use. I notified the committee that they should at some point replace this with this other Denver screen, which is a better example of what the screens actually look like. This is rare for screens, the shell inlay. It's not very common. Okay, but in any case, there's a family known as the Gonzalez family whose members were artists. We believe they might have been of Asian descent. They might have been Chinese or Japanese. And various family members not only produced different types of furniture and objects, but a lot of shell inlay work. Okay, so we don't know the exact artist who made this, but it's been kind of estimated, given sort of the type of object, the way it's constructed, that it was probably produced by someone either from the Gonzalez family or maybe an apprentice or student of one of the Gonzalez artists. So the circle of the Gonzalez family. It's the term, the correct term is biombo in the colonial art historical scholarship. This one they tend to be, because they're freestanding, both sides are painted. And in this one side represents the siege of Belgrade. The other side has a hunting scene, kind of like a genre scene. This dates from the late 17th century, 1697, 1701. Bless you. It's described as tempera and resin on wood with shell inlay. There's a word for shell inlay, and that's enconchado. Concha means shell. Enconchado means kind of shelled. So the word, these objects are known as enconchados. Okay, they're enconchado. That's the correct term for this. We need to look at like Japanese prototypes to understand the kinds of screens that were being brought from Japan through the Manila galleon trade, purchased, by consumers, by all the markets, in New Spain for people's homes, and also the kinds of objects artists were looking at. Artists began to emulate these objects and construct colonial versions, American versions. So what really stands out about the byobu, as I mentioned, is that they're freestanding. Okay, that means then they're usually, the word byobu means wind barrier. So they can be placed in the middle of a room to create privacy, to separate a space. They can be placed before a door or a window. So both sides are decorated. It's not placed against the wall. It's freestanding and both sides are decorated. They're hinged and multi-paneled. They're about this tall. Okay. And in the traditional Japanese byobu, a lot of the representations are garden or landscape scenes, like we see on the left. We also have like urban scenes, as well as narrative illustrations, like episodes of stories, like the Tale of Genji, for instance, is a popular content for screens. So these are the kinds of screens that were arriving from Japan through the Philippines to New Spain and inspiring local artists to produce local variations. But it's important to kind of keep in mind these characteristics of the Japanese originals. Okay, they're freestanding, decorated on both sides, multi-paneled, hinged, and the subjects are landscapes, urban scenes, and narrative illustrations, because these practices continue in the Americas. For example, here's one that's a bit more characteristic. This is unidentified artist, late 17th century. It represents the Alameda Park and then the Viceregal Palace with the procession in front of it. It's oil on canvas, gold, and wood. Okay. And what's interesting about this is you can see how the artist is what he's emulating from the Japanese prints. If you look at the Japanese screens, they use gold. So gold is either used as a background kind of element, or in certain narrative scenes, the gold clouds that are placed are meant to direct your eye through the landscape as the story unfolds. There's a function to gold in Japanese screens. And when we look at this colonial variation, it's like that the artist not understand how the clouds functioned, or is he creating something different? The thing is that he's clearly emulating the use of golden clouds that he must have seen on Japanese screens, but he's creating something different. You know, here the clouds kind of just float in the center of the byombo, but the way that he positions them, there's like a rhythm as you move across the picture space that almost emulates the movement of the procession. You know, there's a certain kind of visual rhythm that is sort of integrated into our reading of the image. Another question has been the perspective. It's always like this aerial perspective looking down. And that's very similar, again, to the Asian perspective that we see. This appears to be something as well that colonial artists were integrating. This particular view, it's like we're floating and looking down at an angle to kind of get a better view of what's happening. In most of these illustrations, it's like we have X-ray vision. The roofs are missing, so we can see what's happening inside the buildings. And this kind of perspective is like what we see in some of these scenes. You know, we're kind of floating above, looking down, but at an angle. So this appears to be something that might be derived from the Japanese originals. I could say more about this image, but I want to show you a few more. You can see the use of gold that's stamped with floral motifs, again coming from the Japanese originals. The perspective, the urban scene, the clouds, all of these seem to be emulating sort of the Japanese visual language of byobu. Mm-hmm.
So is the wood just what the structure of it is?
Yeah, in their panels. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's panels, sometimes it's canvas. Here's another one. This one's at the Franz Mayer Museum in Mexico City. This is an interesting one because this side depicts Mexico City and the other side depicts the conquest. And it's not uncommon to have those two subjects paired, the history scene and the urban scene. And there are legends. There's a key. If you notice, there's writing. Colonial art has writing on it. A lot of it has writing. There's a key that identifies different locations in Mexico City. And many of the locations that are identified in the city are places where important events occurred during the conquest. So the other side depicts the conquest with its own key, identifying each of the different battles, and then the other side is the city. So it makes me think of sort of the indigenous concept of map making, where the landscape elements that are considered important are those places where significant events occurred. So there seems to be some kind of suggestion maybe that there's like an indigenous way of thinking, you know, that is informing these. There's been another suggestion that people living in places like Mexico City were already conditioned for this kind of visual object. And I am referring, if we go back, yeah, to that. There seems to be a suggestion that certain people displayed screen folds in their homes. But it seems like people might have been conditioned. They were familiar with this type of format. So when we get to the point where these Japanese objects are arriving, it would have resonated on some level. They're very similar in form. So then we look at this. We see the city. Something that seems odd is that Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was an island surrounded by lake water. There are actually 5 lakes. And one of the first things the Spanish did after the conquest, besides rebuilding the city using an Italian model, because Italy's the model architecturally speaking, is they filled in the island to connect it to the lakeshore. But throughout the entire colonial period, throughout the 19th century, Mexico City was surrounded by lake. okay, but it was connected to the lakeshore. And here we see an aqueduct. The Aztec had built the aqueduct. It's salt water in the lake. There was a fresh spring in Chapultepec Hill. So the Aztecs had built an aqueduct to bring potable water into the city, and the Spanish maintained it. They're using the aqueduct to continue to bring water to the city. That's what we see here. It becomes an iconic element that's representative of Mexico City. Here's the Alameda Park that we just saw in the other Biombo, and there's the plaza with the Viceregal Palace. And then the other side has the conquest scenes. What's very interesting about the way the gold is applied here, it almost looks architectural, like arches. And it brings to mind a medieval Spanish architectural element that was introduced by Muslims. In the medieval period, in sort of these landed aristocrats' homes, they're normally placed on hills so they can have views of the land around them. And there would be a window called the mirador. Mirador. Mirar means to look. The mirador is like the looking place. And when the house would be designed, these palaces, there would be a window to frame a view. And it would have this kind of arched element. And they were like strategically placed for these aesthetic reasons, to provide pleasing views of the property around. So when we think about that tradition that we see in medieval Spanish architecture, bless you, that is derived from Muslim architecture, and then we look at that, you can sort of see how these arches are being used to kind of frame each of these conquest scenes. It sort of survives as a viewing element to focus your attention to a particular view. Yeah, each of these vertical panels has a different scene. Yeah. And the key here identifies what you see in each of these panels. These biombos can be read in two ways. They can be read horizontally, panoramically, or they can be read vertically. And the vertical panels usually frame individual scenes.
It almost looks like, but they're all part of the same scene.
Yes, they're all part of the same scene. So the biombos, we never see religious images on biombos. The subjects are always non-religious. We have history scenes like with the conquest. There's city scenes of Mexico City. We have allegorical scenes, scenes of viceregal processions. We have genre scenes of people like at parties, dancing, hunting scenes. The biombos, because they're placed in people's homes, the subjects are not religious. And they have an interesting function, because besides functioning as furniture and providing privacy or separating space, they also become like conversation pieces. Let me show you a couple of others. Here's a genre scene. This is the one from the Denver Art Museum that AP should be using, in my opinion. And I'm hoping they see this because it'll be easy to get permission. And this is more representative of the biombo. It's a garden party on the terrace of a country home from around 1725. Again, oil on canvas, gold wood. And it's like a scene of people at a party. These people are playing cards, they're musicians, people are dancing. This gives us an idea of sort of some of the social activities or daily life in viceregal New Spain. We get a lot of information about costuming and like ceramics, material goods. This is more typical of what biombos look like. And here's one that I love. It's one of my favorites by the artist Juan Correa. He's one of the superstars in Mexico City from the late 17th century. And one side, it seems very academic. It's very scholarly. One side depicts the four elements, and the other side depicts the liberal arts. And these are allegorical images. And like the four elements, air, earth, fire, water, they're depicted almost in a classical vocabulary, like nymphs or gods on carriages. Okay, clearly based on a European visual language that is introduced into New Spain. And then you have the texts that are poetic texts identifying the elements. And then on the other side, you have allegorical representations of each of the liberal arts, like rhetoric or history, geometry, along with texts identifying the liberal art. And this is kind of faded, but these little poetic texts, that say something about that particular liberal art. And when you think about this kind of object, typically in a reception room, like a living room, what we would call a living room or a salon where you would receive guests, you can imagine this in there and this kind of inspiring different topics of conversation. Maybe something about history or maybe something scientific. There are universities. That's something else that never gets talked about in the colonial periods, that there are universities very early. So there's science and engineering. It's not just religion, art, and culture. There are actually academic pursuits that are explored. So this kind of subject matter, it goes beyond the mere decorative, given its content. There is this interest in intellectual discourse. So these objects would have functioned, in some cases, probably as conversation pieces. Okay, there's an interesting description of one of these biombos, which would have been closer to this one. In a dining room in one of the, I'm talking about the aristocracy who live in these palatial homes. They're just gorgeous, filled with objects from all parts of the world. They'll have like Chippendale furniture next to Italian tapestries, Korean porcelain. Their homes would just be filled with these luxurious objects and paintings and whatnot, rugs. And there's an interesting description of a dining room where there's like a dinner party in one of these palaces, and a biombo that shows a genre scene is in a corner, and there are musicians behind the biombo. So you can't see them. The biombo depicts musicians like this, but the musicians quietly play behind the biombo to entertain the guests. So it's almost like the biombo's alive and performing for you. They might have been used to cover the entrance to the kitchen, but there's this one case where they were used to hide the musicians, as guests were being entertained. So these people, if I ever lived in the past, I'd have to be part of the 1%. Because no matter when you lived, if you're elite, you've got it good. Anything other, forget it. These people who were wealthy and aristocrats had an amazing life. These palatial homes filled with these luxurious objects, the most amazing food, staff, and servants. It was not a bad life, And Juan Correa. And so we're back to this. So then we have this. So you can see how it fits within the language of biombos. The freestanding, multi-paneled hinge screen. We have the use of arches here, floral. On one side it's floral. That use of floral decorative element seems to be also inspired by the use of like peonies and other floral elements in Japanese screens. Although it's also been associated with sort of the Rococo aesthetic, in the 18th century. And then we have like a history scene and then a genre scene, a hunting scene. And what makes this different is that in addition to being partially painted, it also has that shell inlay. And the whole shell inlay thing is really interesting because I don't know, I've seen some of these in Latin America, and they are stunning works. There's a big screen, I think it was in the Medici collection, that depicts the conquest, where there are hundreds of figures battling. And the artist very strategically uses shell because it's iridescent and it shifts. And it imbues the crowd with movement. It looks like the figures move because they're iridescent. So there are very strategic ways. It's not just slapped on. There are very strategic ways that artists use the shell to enhance sort of movement, to enhance light, especially with religious images. So there's like a logic or intention behind the use of shell that's very carefully done. Okay. Since we're talking about shell work or enconchados, we need to kind of shift then to the image of the Virgin that's in here. I originally had asked to have the original image of the Virgin that is associated with its apparition to Juan Diego on the tilma, which is in the Basilica of the Virgin in Mexico City. But they weren't able to get copyright permission. The thing is, you don't need copyright permission to reproduce that image. So I'm hoping that at some point they're able to incorporate the image into the image set, because that's really the image I wanted to use as an example of religious imagery, but also the Virgin of Guadalupe is central as a founding myth for Mexico.
I show my students side by side.
Dude, that'd be great. No, yeah, if you can bring it in your classes, please do. That's really the image that I want to focus on. But since we have this enconchado image, I want to talk a little bit about religious images and continue the conversation about shell inlay. So when we talk about religious images, there are three general types that we see in colonial art. There are devotional images, like the Virgin image. These are like the single images of saints or Christ or Mary that are meant to inspire or guide prayer and meditation. Then we have narrative illustrations, like scenes from the life of Christ or scenes from the life of Mary. These follow their exploits, their events through the course of their life. And then we have allegorical images. They're more like symbolic images of like the Christ Passion or things of that sort. And then enconchado, the term I already introduced you to, which means shell inlay. This is the image, of course, by Miguel Gonzalez, who's a member of the Gonzalez family we're talking about. The Virgen of Guadalupe from around 1698, oil on canvas on wood with shell inlay. And here you can see how the artist carefully uses the shell to kind of enhance sort of the reflective quality of the shell. This is one of the things that really appealed, I think, to local audiences. If you think about sort of the native valuation of reflective surfaces and iridescence, like in the feathers and feather painting. You can see how this kind of iridescent quality would have appealed to a local aesthetic, especially when it's combined with holy images or sacred images. And here he uses the shell to comprise the body of the Virgin, as well as for other details like the little frames that depict different scenes from the story of her apparition. This image is very different from the original image. The original image is a devotional image. This is just the image of the Virgin. Iconographically, the Virgen de Guadalupe is related to a genre of Virgin or Marian representation known as the Apocalyptic Virgin. There are different versions of the Apocalyptic Virgin, and the Virgen de Guadalupe is, kind of belongs to that genre of Marian iconography, the Apocalyptic Virgin. She's an Apocalyptic Virgin. If you ever see like an image of the Virgin taking central space, floating up in the heavens, it belongs to this Marian iconographical language of the Apocalyptic Virgin. This one's different because we do see the Virgin in the center, but she's surrounded by 4 images that are different episodes in the story of her apparition. So when she appears to Juan Diego, she tells him to go to the Archbishop, Zumárraga. Zumárraga doesn't believe him. He goes back. He asks for some kind of miracle. There's one image that's missing. There are actually 5 events in the story, but the artist got rid of the 5th one because it doesn't fit, just to use the 4 corners. The image that always gets left out is Juan Diego had an uncle who was dying. Then the Virgin appears to the uncle and heals him. So that becomes a miracle. But that's left out of here. What we see is the Virgin appearing to Juan Diego, him going to Juan de Zumárraga, him going back to the Virgin, and then going back to the bishop. And this time that's when the roses fall out of his mantle and the image of the Virgin is impressed on his mantle. That's the miracle, okay? And that's what convinces Zumárraga that she actually did appear to him, and that's when he constructs the first temple to her, the first shrine, right at the spot where she appeared. So this can be considered like a cross between a devotional and a narrative image. Also the framework, it's lacquered. Again, this is something coming out of Japanese or Asian art influences, the use of lacquer and inlay. There's a lot of inlay, not just of shell, but of other types of wood as well.
Where's that information all written down?
For enconchados, there should be like a blurb for AP, on AP, a website, but you can, there hasn't been any like sustained study on this. There are very few pieces that we have.
Get that history of it. Like, how do they know that
About-
I couldn't look at that.
Oh, no, for the Virgin, there's a ton written. There are oodles and oodles of books. If you're interested in reading more about the Virgin iconography, which would be very helpful with this, you should look at the work of Jeanette Peterson. Jeanette, Jeanette, Jeanette Peterson, Peterson. She published a book just recently, a couple years ago, called Visualizing the Virgin. She's like the foremost expert on Virgin iconography. And she's published a few other articles as well that I think you might find useful. But in terms of enconchado as a technique, there's not that much written about it. Your best bet would be to look at exhibition catalogs that have enconchado works in them and like little blurbs, little entries. Yeah.
This story would be easily
Yeah.
attainable just by
Easily.
Juan Diego
Yeah.
and the Virgin.
It's easy.
The Virgin of Guadalupe image, the original one, is the most visited pilgrimage site on earth,
Yeah,
with number 1, of course, being Mecca.
yeah.
So, was that why you wanted the Virgin of Guadalupe, the original one, put in and not this one?
Yeah, I wouldn't have included any enconchado because it's not a dominant form. With only 6 images, I wanted to include works that were really representative, of a larger body of material. That's why for the biombo, it would have been one of the painted biombos, like the one at Denver. And I wanted the Virgin image because we didn't have any religious images from the colonial context, and that's the most important one. It's iconic,
Yeah, I did the same thing. I included it when we
Good.
discussed it, and I wondered why we weren't doing that one and this one.
It's because
instead.
the College Board's a stickler, and if you can't get a copyright permission, they don't want to publish it. They don't want to get sued. But like I said, anybody can publish. I just did in my book. And I talked to Jeanette. She was like, oh yeah, you can publish it as long as it's not defamatory. As long as it's respectful and scholar, da-da-da. And yeah, I don't have any problems. I mean, she's been publishing the image. Other people have been publishing. You don't need permission. But I don't know how flexible College Board would be with that. I mean, you can write to the Basilica till you're blue in the face, and they're not going to respond. But yeah, that's the issue with the Virgin.
But having the original makes it nice because you
Yeah.
can make that connection with other pilgrimage sites. We have,
Sure.
like,
That's a very good point. That's another reason I actually pulled this up too, because I thought one of the things that we integrated into the framework for the new curriculum, if you noticed, is comparisons, both cross-culturally and trans-historically. So thinking about what are the kinds of themes. Well, there's portraiture, there's architecture, but the whole pilgrimage issue, really brings an interesting question into it, and you can draw from other categories, as you were noting. That would be an excellent way to use the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is one of the reasons I wanted it incorporated, but like I said, we'd run into that copyright problem. So I'm hoping at some point they can change the Biombo and the Virgen de Guadalupe, but we'll see. And here's a very bad image of the original that's on display at the Basilica of the Virgin in the north part of Mexico City. Jeanette Peterson thinks she might have identified the artist. Because according to the story, it just appears miraculously. These kinds of images that just appear out of the blue, out of divine sort of intervention. There's like a long Greek word that we use. ACHEIROPOEITIC, chiropoietic. That word refers to images that appear spontaneously because of they're of divine creation, divine manufacture. So this image, which is on a mantle, was supposedly, it appeared miraculously on Juan Diego's mantle. He opened his mantle, roses fell out, and there's the image. And that was the miracle, to convince the Archbishop that this actually had occurred and to build a shrine to her at the site of her apparition, her appearance. You're right. That was miraculous. There are no roses locally. That was part of the miracle. It's also during winter, and they appear. So there are all these miracles associated with the apparition. But this is the image, and and Jeanette Peterson's done a lot of work on the image, and she thinks she's identified the native artists who painted this. So if you read Jeanette Peterson, you can get more information about this particular image. Here I just added unidentified artists. The years have changed from 1535 to 1555. There's a little kind of, it's not precise, but it's somewhere in the early to mid 16th century. Oil and tempera on cloth. The mantle is known as a tilma. That's what that term, that's the Nahuatl word for the mantle that he was wearing. It's a tilma. And this is currently located in the Basilica. You can go, and they have a conveyor belt in front of it because they don't want people just standing there. So you stand, and it's like, you can see it. Yeah, it's a little cheesy, but otherwise people would be in front of it forever. But in any case, but it's clearly like a Renaissance image. Its visual language is associated with Renaissance, Marian iconography. So like I said, to learn more about this, definitely look at Jeanette Peterson's work. Her book and then her publications. And there are others who have written about it. Like I said, there's a huge body of scholarship on the Virgin. It's actually quite overwhelming to sift through. So Peterson's a good place to start. There are variations. That shell image is related to this particular composition. This is Miguel Cabrera's version, one of his paintings. He was a Marian. He was a really faithful follower of this Marian devotion. He was a Guadalupano. He was a painter working in the mid-18th century in Mexico City. He's like the superstar of the 18th century. And he painted numerous versions of the Virgen, and this is one of them. That has the 4 apparitions. I wanted to show you this as a painted example of that same composition, and it's also clear. It's more legible. You can see the episodes more clearly rendered in this painting. And those of us who grew up Catholic, we all had lithographs of this in our home. I grew up with this image in my home. Yeah, we all have images of the Virgen in our home. We have little altars. And this is just another example of an enconchado. This is Juan Correa, the artist who painted that screen with the liberal arts and the elements. His brother was an artist as well. Because we don't have an academy yet. The academy is not founded to the 1780s. So we have the workshop system with master and apprentice. So it's very common for artists to train their children, especially their sons, although there's suggestion that girls were taught too. That's a whole area that needs more work. But so Nicolás was Juan Correa. Juan Correa is the superstar. Nicolás is not as famous, but he was an artist as well. And he did Enconchado. This is of a series, Scenes from the Life of Christ. It's a narrative illustration, The Wedding at Cana. And these works are spectacular. They're visually just stunning. You don't even get a sense. He uses different kinds of shell. One kind of shell looks golder and one looks silvery. And look how precise he uses this for like the decorative elements, almost like lace work. You know, when you look at this, it just shimmers.
How big is that?
It's about this big. Yeah, I've seen this work. It can't get too big. You know, you're dealing with like small pieces of shell, so they're usually about this big. The size.
Where are they?
This one I'm not sure where it is. Some of these are in collections in Mexico, and I think I think there are a couple in the U.S. There aren't that many, you know, that we have that are publicly. I'm sure a lot of these are in private people's homes. Yeah, that's another issue with colonial art, is that so much of it tends to focus on religious art, but that's because so many of the museums that have colonial art have colonial painting, because when the museums are being founded, they pretty much raided the churches and monasteries. They didn't have any money, so the collections are formed by work that was accessible and free. And non-religious works like portraits and biombos are in people's homes. There's not a philanthropic tradition in Mexico or Latin America like we have here. I think this has to do with the history of economic instability and political unrest. People hold on to their possessions and just bequeath them, you know, to their children and to their children. So these things stay in the family. I've been to homes in Mexico City where I see colonial paintings in the dining room and pre-Hispanic vessels in the living room, and their homes are just filled with this kind of material.
They would hold on to them when
Yeah,
people
right, exactly. Yeah,
university or
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there are a few examples that are publicly accessible, and I think most of these are in Mexico, but I think there are a couple here in the U.S. They're very rare, but just to kind of give you another example of what the use of shell can be used for. I mean, it's just really quite a stunning type of work. Now we're going to move to something that a lot of people love, you know, pinturas de casta, or cast paintings, casta paintings, or different words. Are really the works that opened an interest into the 18th century. They're a genre of painting that seemed to be particular to the 18th century in New Spain. Okay, there are certain kinds of paintings that depict race in Peru, but they're very different from the cast paintings. So the cast paintings seem to be very unique to New Spain, and specifically to the area around, of course, Mexico City. And what pinturas de casta are, this is the one in the image set. This has been attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez. He was a painter working in the early 18th century, and he seems to be the first colonial painter that is working with the new Bourbon viceregal court. Okay, the Bourbons come into the throne in 1700 after the War of Succession, 1700, 1715, and Juan Rodriguez Juarez becomes a painter for the Bourbon viceregal court. So he's probably like the first Bourbon colonial painter who works for the court, the viceregal court in Mexico City. And like many artists of his time, I mean, he did portraits. There are a lot of portraits. He did religious images. He did, in the 18th century, all the major artists do cast paintings at one time or another. You know, so this is one image of a series of cast paintings that were produced, or we think are produced by Rodriguez Juarez. It makes sense, around 1715. And what we're looking at here, again, we have text to clarify in case you don't know what you're looking at. We have, it says, of a Spaniard and an Indian produces mestizo. So you have the Spanish man. He's either Creole, either American born or from Spain. We can't tell. He's just called Spanish. He could have been an American Creole. Then we have an Indian woman who's dressed very well. You know, she's dressed in indigenous style, but clearly well off. And their two mestizo children. Okay, and it's like a family scene. And one of the questions we have to ask is if they're interested in depictions of racial types, why not just have like the mulatto and the mestizo? Why bring the father and the mother into it? I'm going to explain why. Cast paintings take one of two forms. Oh, here are just two others. They're part of a series. This one is of Spaniard and mestizo, produced castizo. Of Spaniard and a black woman, they produce mulatto. Just examples from this one series. Here is a self-portrait of Juan Rodriguez Juarez, one of the few self-portraits we have. I think there are only 2 or 3 that I know of. This is one of them from around 1710, I'm guessing, on canvas. And then to the right is one of the individuals who was like a patron. He's the viceroy, the first Bourbon viceroy, the Duke of Linares. That he painted that portrait. And you can tell the style is the French influence with the wig and the velvet waistcoat, the gauntlets, the gloves, typical of colonial portraiture with the drape element, the crest, writing in a cartouche that it's almost like a CV. It identifies who it is, any major accomplishments. Then there's always some kind of table with objects on it that refer back to the individual's profession or status. This is the typical language. It's full length, quarter turn, sumptuous dress, drape element, objects, cartouche, family crest. We're going to see this language repeatedly in colonial portraiture or secular colonial portraiture. So cast paintings take one of two forms. The whole issue of castas is really interesting because, the first artist we think produced an early version of this. I don't have images of his work. His last name was Arellano. Very, very early. There's at least one painting I've seen known to be by him that seems to depict a mestiza. Okay, but it's very, very different. It's Juan Rodriguez Juarez who produces the type of cast painting that becomes a model. That is where you have a family group. But and the casts reflect the racial mixing in Novo Hispanic society. And you start with three parent groups. There's the white Spaniard, typically male, the Indian woman, and the black. Okay? And you always start, and it's in a series of 16 vignettes. The thing is that there are numerous names, there are numerous categories of castas, but in there are as many as there are over 60 in some of the more populated areas, and as few as 4 or 6 out in the countryside. But in terms of the paintings itself, they get sort of codified into 16. So you have either all 16 on one canvas like this, like a taxonomic chart. Here we have to think about Enlightenment ideas and kind of pseudo-scientific interest in identifying and organizing and taxonomies, So it's like a taxonomic chart. There are 4 registers with 4 vignettes running across. Or if you have the money and the space, you can commission to have a series of cast paintings where each of the vignettes becomes an individual canvas. Okay, those are the 2 versions, either all on one canvas, like a taxonomic chart, or in a series of individual canvases that depict the racial mixing. It always starts with the white Spanish man mixing with the Indian woman, producing a mestizo. And what's really interesting, if you look at the first couple of vignettes, that embedded in these paintings, there's a suggestion that you can mix with natives. You can be a Spaniard, mix with native, but your descendants could go back to being Spanish. So it's not all lost if you mix with a native. So the first image, of course, is the Spaniard with an Indian producing a mestizo. Then that product is then mixing back with the Spaniard in the next vignette, producing what's called a castizo, who's lighter. And then the castizo then shows up in the next vignette, mixing with the Spaniard, producing a Spaniard. And to me, that's a very interesting dynamic in the 18th century, because in the 18th century, when we start to see sort of this interest in independence, the Creoles, the upper class aristocratic Hispanics, the American-born Hispanics, the Creoles, one of the arguments they seem to present to justify sort of their valid claim to self-sovereignty is that even though they're white, that they're all mestizo, because their ancestors mixed with Indians. And not just any Indians, they mixed with upper-class Aztec. Okay? So they have Indian blood in them, which makes them mestizo, which gives them a claim to the land. Okay? So when you think about that kind of argument that we see in the 18th century, then you look at the first couple of vignettes, it seems to kind of illustrate how that happens. Is you can mix with the native, but if your descendants keep mixing back with Spaniards, you can reach back Spanish status. Okay? It's an interesting kind of political thing there.
So the castizo, what is that?
That's a mixture of mestizo and Spanish.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's kind of like on your way back.
Yes, yeah. The castizo's lighter than the mestizo. Then when the castizo mixes with the Spaniard, they produce a Spanish again. But once you have black, you can't go back. Once the black gets mixed in, there's no way you can go back to being Spanish. The Bourbons actually passed policies to prevent racial mixing with blacks. There was a really strong kind of racist element to the Bourbons where they actually implemented policies to prevent certain kinds of miscegenation. So mixing with the black is a no-no. And what you see in the rest of the casts are all the different mixtures from that point forward. And the more mixed you become, the darker skinned. And it's not just about phenotype. There's an element here of, or elements that suggest profession or trade, class, but also character. In many cases, the cast paintings are very stereotypical and offensive. You know, where like black women are depicted as sexual or as violent and aggressive, or the more mixed you are, the poorer you are, the more violently inherent you are, criminal, okay? And to me, a lot of people misread these. This does not give us a window into what the population in Mexico City would look like. This kind of gives us sort of an interpretation of, or an ideology. It's a representation of an ideology of difference. The majority of whites, the light-skinned Hispanics, were poor. The majority of them were poor, but you don't see any light-skinned people at the bottom. You know, the light-skinned people are towards the top. And the idea here, kind of reflecting what was an obsession for the Spanish, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, was an obsession for the Spanish. And it still is today in Latin America. Latin America is still very colonial in these kinds of hierarchies. Limpieza de sangre, if you look at any elite classes in Latin America, they're all European looking. They're very white. You just look at telenovelas. It's all the white Mexicans. You know, limpieza de sangre means purity of blood. And this is something that can be traced back to the 15th century in Spain when the Muslims were expelled and the Jews were forcibly converted. This obsession with demonstrating that you're not tainted by Muslim or African or Jewish blood becomes a thing that gets incorporated into colonial policy. In order to serve as a colonial official, you have to demonstrate old Christian stock and purity of blood. That is brought to the Americas, where now the Indians and the blacks and the Asians are implicated. So limpieza de sangre is kind of this obsession. And in the 18th century, mixing with black, this dilution was believed to not only change you racially or phenotypically, but also affect or degrade the quality of your character. Okay, so what we see here is, this is an earlier one. They look like almost like mannequins in a natural history museum. You know, they're just wearing the outfits, standing in blank backgrounds, but eventually there's backgrounds like this one. They're shopping. They're clearly at a market. They're shopping for textiles. She's dressed very nicely. Okay, let's look at some others. The one on the left, we know this is not about a race as we understand it, because the albino is incorporated. We know that's not a race. It's really interesting about the albino. She was sort of a question mark and a threat, because she looks white, but she might be mixed. You just can't tell because she's albino. So in the cast paintings, when the albino's married to the Spaniard, or we don't know if they're married, but she's with the Spaniard, she always produces a black child. Torna atrás, some of these names are crazy. It means turn backward, to look backward, or to go backward. Okay? So when the albino always, in the cast paintings, we know this genetically is improbable, but at least in the language of cast paintings, it's codified, where the albino woman always has a black child. You know, and this becomes sort of an obsession. I always tell my classes about when I was really little in San Antonio. My mom's from Mexico. We would go watch Mexican movies from the Golden Age, the 40s and 50s. There was a theater downtown. And in the 60s, when I was really little, we would go downtown to see the movies. And there was a group of movies made back in the 40s and 50s that kind of focused on this kind of obsession with race. This is in the 20th century. There's one movie called Angelitos Negros, Little Black Angels. And it's about this like upper-class Mexico City girl. She's light-skinned, of course, wealthy, the toast of the town. She's engaged to marry this wealthy young man from a well-positioned family, again, light-skinned, Mexico City. Everybody loves them. They have their friends. She was raised by her black nanny and her father. Her mother died in childbirth, so the nanny raised her. Well, they get married. She gets pregnant. Everyone's happy. And she gives birth to a black baby. And the husband leaves her, and the friends stop talking to her, and she rejects the baby. The nanny takes the baby. It's a Mexican movie, so it has a moral. You know, she eventually turns out that her mother's actually the black nanny, that her father had an affair with a black servant, which is common in the colonial period. White men were like getting around. And so it turns out her father had an affair with the black nanny, and her mother had committed suicide. She hadn't died in childbirth. She was raised by her mother, the black nanny. So by the end of the movie, she comes around, the black nanny's dying, she accepts her baby and accepts the black nanny as her mother, and everybody's happy, you know, has like a good moral conclusion. But to me, it's just astounding, you know, yeah, that we look at this from the colonial period, and in Mexico, it's still a thing.
Well, my question was too, were the people living, because we know that the people buying these were in Spain, right, to understand?
Well, it appears that the first cast paintings were commissioned to be taken back, just like the manuscripts much earlier, to take back to Spain so they can see American types.
Right.
Okay.
So were those living there, did they I am a castiza or I'm a mestiza, would they know those things, and would that be an issue in marrying? Like, were they as
Yeah.
obsessed with it as maybe Spaniards?
Well, I mean, there's been a suggestion that the castas didn't really exist because the racial mixing is so fluid. But what we do find, there's a scholar, R. Douglas Cope, who went through archives looking primarily 16th, 17th century. And what he identified was that people were illiterate. Okay, marriage, most people didn't marry. Marriage was something conducted only by the upper class. There's even there's some cases where the common population ridicule marriage as a Spanish kind of practice. You know, people would just shack up, have kids, break up. You know, it was very fluid, unstable. We don't see marriage promoted until this period, the 18th century, which is one of the reasons I think we have this emphasis on family. But before this, people didn't marry. The majority of people didn't marry. But when a child is born, they would still get it baptized and registered. And he looked at all these archives, and what he finds is because most people were illiterate, they couldn't read, and most of them, because of the nature of instability in the home, they didn't know their parents' names. They didn't know their own last names. So the church official would see a man and a woman bringing their child to be baptized, and he would look at them, and they don't know their last names, so he would look at her, her name's Juana, and he'd be like, you look like you're part black. So he'd just write Juana la Mulata. That's her name in the record. They'd be identified by the phenotype. And he would look at the man, Pedro, he looks Indian, Pedro el Indio. Their kid clearly is a mixture, so, you know, Pedro el Lobo, whatever the caste name is. And that's how they're recorded in the documents. They don't know their names, so the castes would surface as identifiers in legal.
Maybe not that they would self-identify.
Yeah.
But in these
Yeah,
records.
right, yeah. You know, and the things that what we understand as race, of course, it's a social construction, but it's very slippery and unstable because race exists on multiple levels. On one hand, you have phenotype, okay, and the way you look and how other people see you. But you can also, during the colonial period, it was possible to change your racial status if you paid for it. It's called gracias al sacar. Yeah. You don't know me. So these petitions were called gracias al sacar, thanks for taking me out. And you could pay to have your racial status changed. You know, so there are cases like where like natives or mestizos become wealthy. They become affluent and then they pay to change their racial status legally. I even came across a suggestion that there might even been like a white who changed their status down to Indian because natives were exempt from paying tax. These are artists. And there's at least one case I remember coming across where a white Creole changed his status to Indian to kind of avoid having to pay tax on what he was making.
Oh, so you could pay down.
Yeah, yeah. So there's like, and so you have race, you know, visually. There's the phenotype. There's legally. There's also the nicknames. People call each other by nicknames. You know, even my family, one of my cousins looked Asian. We called him Chino, Chinese. You know, it still survives today. The use of, and I think the cast paintings must have been based on these earlier nomenclatures that predate the images. When the first artist was asked, produce an image of types, well, he's never seen this before. What do you think he's basing it on? Or he's basing it on the different categories, which survive in social practice through nicknames, which survive legally in the form of documents, you know, in addition to whatever you think someone looks like. I mean, so it's this very kind of complicated thing that gets negotiated in a number of ways. So a lot of people don't know how to read colonial documents. And this is an issue I have with, you know, especially people in New Mexico. I found this to be true in some cases. When they see the word Espanol, they automatically think they're from Spain. That's not necessarily the case. They could have been American born. And they might not even be Spanish. They could be mestizo. There's no way of really knowing sort of racial makeup. So race is kind of the slippery thing. But what happens here is, as some scholars have suggested, like Ilona Katsu, who's written a lot about this, is that this appears to be an attempt to kind of control the racial mixing that was really out of control. It was the Bourbons were trying to control it and stop it, but people were doing it. And the cast paintings, according to some, it seems to be like an attempt to kind of like codify and control, you know, this type of mixing. And then, I don't know, that's just it. That's just it.
Are there any reverse ones where it shows Indian man?
There's one, yeah, it becomes political in the late 18th century, but there's one particular painting that, it's not a cast painting, it has two rows of casts, landscapes, a still life at the bottom, and the Virgen de Guadalupe. It's all about an American experience. It's clearly a political painting to me. And that cast painting is the only one I've seen where it's an Indian man with a white woman, which would have been a no-no. You know, white women's bodies were controlled, especially elites, because white skin is important. You wanted to marry into the right families to consolidate wealth and power, and you wanted to have white babies, okay? So white women, especially elite white women, their movements were very controlled. And their lives were determined by the men in their lives. First their father, then their husband, maybe their brothers if they weren't married yet, later maybe their sons, you know, because the fear was that she would get involved with someone from the lower class or non-white and then mix. Okay, that was always like an obsession. It was an obsession. So elite white women were very controlled. So that cast painting that has all these references to America, like local fruits in the still life, the cast process, landscapes or images of areas in and around Mexico City, and then the Virgen de Guadalupe on top of it all. I mean, clearly it's some kind of commentary on American identity and experience, but the very first vignette switches the typical format. It has an Indian male with a white woman, which would have been really like scandalous. It's a painting by this less known artist named Luis de Mena. I always show that in my classes. But in any case, just examples, and in terms of social rank, profession or trade, and then character, these are just examples. The lighter skinned individuals don't work. They're like in these very comfortable settings. Here you have the father playing the violin, teaching his son the violin. They're dressed nicely. You know, they're very comfortable. It's leisurely activity. The darker people are out on the street selling food or cigarettes or whatnot. They're working. Okay, so there's that kind of association of skin color with trade, profession, and also intelligence, skill, quality, character. And some of these have been compared, for example, to these Rococo types of genre scenes, like a Fragonard's Le Roux Ménage, The Happy Marriage, Family, 1778-80. And I think that there is an association to be made there, this kind of representation of a family, either at leisure, at play, or at work. But there's some local elements that are also important to understand. This is Bartolomé Murillo, who is a Spanish painter from Seville, the Holy Family in the Carpenter's Workshop. Again, Joseph, Mary, and Christ. This becomes a model for the ideal Christian family. The ideal Christian family, the good colonial subject, the marriage is stable, everyone is trained, everyone is working. You know, the Bourbons open schools to train not just men, but women and children in different industries. They push marriage to stabilize the family unit, to make census recording more accurate. So everything they do is done to increase economic productivity. Stabilizing the marriage, training everybody, putting everyone to work, increases productivity. And you can keep track of them through the census because they're marrying now, so there's documents now that help you identify the population. And I think all of these images kind of respond to this larger political context. You have the focus on families and working in cast paintings, and then you have these kinds of images also circulating, the ideal, I mean, the prototype of the Christian family, you know, the Holy Family in the Workshop. I mean, I think it's pretty clear what the agenda is.
This Murillo, that
Yeah.
you say it Murillo?
Mm-hmm.
And because of the discussion of the cast paintings, I'm now noticing that Joseph is browner, and so is John the Baptist.
Mm.
And the Virgin and the Christ Child are the whiter skin.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting I mean, Murillo wouldn't have been thinking about elevating.
Right,
And he
right.
would have been.
No,
No, but
no,
it's just the
no.
way that they
Yeah.
painted.
yeah. You know, and we have colonial versions of this subject, you know, disseminated, you know. So what I'm saying is all these things intersect and kind of reflect its period. This would not have happened in the Habsburg period. It's clearly a Bourbon period kind of phenomenon. Yeah. Right. Right, exactly. And the Bourbons also saw the church as competition. You know, the Habsburgs, you know, worked very closely with the church. But the Bourbons come in, they believe, you know, they're kind of separating church and state, and they want the church's wealth, and they start stripping the church of its privileges and power. Before, education fell in the realm of the church. They were all religious professors and scholars. Marriage was a sacrament. The church promoted that. But in the 18th century, the Bourbon take that over. They take over education. It becomes secularized. They're the ones who start promoting marriage. So they start stripping the church of its privileges and its power, and also its properties at some point. You know, I mean, Spain's sinking. You know, it's in economically dire straits, and everything the Bourbons do, as I mentioned, through increased productivity, increased taxation, introducing new engineering technologies to increase mining production, is to support Spain, which is sinking. Spain's done, very clearly. Everything the Bourbons do is to try to reinforce Spain's standing, but it just seems like there's no way around the fact that Spain is done. In short, just a few years after this, then Spain's empire starts to fall apart. Okay. Let's look at portraits. I think I'm making good time. There's a lot to say. Portraits are my thing. It's what I focus on. And this is the image that I added to the image list. There's like hundreds and hundreds of portraits of men and women and nuns and whatnot. But I felt this was the important one to include as an exemplar of portraiture. We can talk about different types of portraits. This is by Miguel Cabrera, that mid-18th century painter. Painted around 1750. It can be considered like a historical portrait because by 1750 she's been dead like almost 70 years. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz lived in the late 17th century. And as some of you may know already if you read the blurb on the AP Art History site, Sor Juana was a prodigy. She was absolutely brilliant, and she didn't want to marry. She joins another convent and then eventually winds up with the Hieronymites, and she devotes her life to study. She's a scholar. She's believed to have had one of the largest libraries in New Spain, if not the Americas. She wrote poetry. She wrote all sorts of things, and she was a celebrity during her life. She was befriended by the viceroy, especially the viceroy's wife, the vicereine. She would visit her all the time, and there's some suggestion. Sor Juana wrote poetry for the viceroy that's very erotic, so there appears to have been a suggestion that there was some kind of romantic thing happening between Sor Juana and the viceroy's wife.
Netflix has a series.
Yeah, Sor Juana. There's a series, an 8-episode series.
She wrote poems about his wife.
Yeah, about the viceroy, who they were friends. She was her
She asked
patroness.
her to write poems for him,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. And she would visit her all the time, and she was friends with all the celebrities. She was friends with the artists and church officials, and she was well known, very impressive. And this portrait allows us to talk about gender in the colonial context, and especially the context of convents. Convents are fascinating things to talk about because they're not like what we think of convents today. Back in the colonial period, there are different types of convents that reflect the social hierarchy. There was an imperial convent for noble women from Spain. There were elite aristocratic convents, quite a few, for aristocratic, Creoles, Creole women. Then you have convents for poor women. And then some convents almost function like hospitals or mental asylums, for homeless women and whatnot. So the convent structure seems to kind of reflect the social hierarchy, but the very wealthy aristocratic convents, they were very prestigious. And elite families wanted to have their daughters in the convents. It added to their prestige and their cultural capital. A daughter's stay in the convent could be temporary until she was ready to marry to keep her out of trouble. They'd stick her in a convent. Or she could devote her life to convent life, which varied. The convent cultures vary. Some are really take vows of poverty, and they spend their lives just praying and meditating, doing charitable acts. Other convents were like palaces, where they had slaves and servants, and they're quite amazing places. And the interesting thing about convents is that convents provide spaces for women who don't want to pursue the typical expectations of women. You don't have to get married. You can study and be literate, So the convent, actually religious individuals like nuns and friars were not considered male or female. They were considered a third gender because they were freed. They were freed. Friars and nuns were not, they were considered like a third gender because they were freed from the expectations of men and women out in outer society, which meant that in the convent, women could be scholars. Another thing to think about is, especially with the very wealthy aristocratic convents, in order to get your daughter in, it's like a sorority. You have to pay a dowry. And the rituals, like she's getting married to Christ, there's a whole elaborate ritual around that. I'm going to talk about that shortly. But families had to pay a large dowry. So if you can think of a convent that had 50 young women, it's a lot of money. So in the convent, in the colonial period, convents functioned like banks. It's the convents that gave out loans and credit with interest. The nuns bought properties and rented them out. The nuns in the convents were patronesses of the art. They were art patrons. So women had power in the convent. They were freed. They didn't have to get married. and be subservient. They were in the convent where they could be scholars, they could be managers, financiers, patrons. So the convent's a very interesting institution in the colonial period. So understanding that about convents, there's a lot of material on convents if you're interested in that. Then we can place this portrait in its place, and you can understand then. She didn't want to get married, she wanted to study, she goes into the convent, devotes her life to study, to reading, to writing, to producing. What got her in trouble is that she wrote a letter that was critical of a church official. And he eventually realized what happened, and she got censored. So what they did is they removed her library, and she was not allowed to read or write anymore. And shortly thereafter, and she was miserable, of course, but that was her punishment. And she wound up, during an epidemic, getting sick and died. She died at, I think, at 42 years of age. But she was a genius. She's a prodigy. There's a famous scene. There have been plays of her life, and now that series.
Recommend the series, or is it off historically? Is it?
No, you should see it. Yeah, it's yeah. It's only 8 episodes, but it's
subtitles.
Like
It's all in
Sor
Spanish.
Juana, what is it called?
Sor Juana.
Sor Juana.
Yeah. So there's a whole body of scholarship around Sor Juana. There's a whole body of scholarship because of how we understand who she is. I mean, feminists, she's become like an icon for Latinas and Chicanas. She's like of the feminist movement. For the LGBTQ movement, she's become sort of an icon. So, I mean, she's really, like many of these historical figures, they become symbols, and she's one of these very important figures historically. So during this period, so she lived in the late 17th century. She's been dead for a while. This is the mid to late 18th century, where we find that the Spanish Bourbons are criticizing American-born Creoles. They're criticizing American-born Hispanics and accusing them of being intellectually lethargic, of being dissolute and undisciplined. It's like this propaganda, against the American-born Hispanics. And American-born Hispanics and Creoles start to respond and defend themselves, saying, no, we have an intellectual tradition. We are disciplined. And there's this one Creole, Jose Aguilar Yeguren, who publishes a book called Biblioteca Mexicana, Mexican Library, where he traces the philosophers, the major thinkers in Mexico, starting with the Aztec philosophers, all the way through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, sort of as a demonstration of the intellectual tradition that's local. You have artists like Miguel Cabrera. If you look at this is painted right when this is happening. It's a local celebrity. It's a Creole intellectual. And what's interesting about this painting, when you compare it to other portraits, these are what the typical female portraits look like. And these two are half-length. They're quarter-turn. They're dressed in sumptuous fabrics. They're a little bit different than the male. There's a drape element. The women always hold objects in their hands, either a fan or a little watch or a flower. They're symbols of luxury, of femininity, beauty. They're bejeweled and fixed up. There's drape elements behind their head. But unlike the male portraits, usually you don't see a family crest, with some exceptions, or a cartouche. Okay? But this is typically what female portraits look like. And individuals who have written about Sor Juana kind of see some of that language in here, the way she's sitting, kind of daintily holding a rosary like it's a necklace. We see some of that kind of luxurious element integrated into this image of this nun. And another thing, this is really a groundbreaking portrait, because typically what we see are men in studies or at desks. Church founding fathers, evangelists. Okay, here Saint Jerome, Caravaggio, or Philippe de Champagne, Saint Augustine, being divinely inspired, writing. This is typically the subject. It's male. It's like a masculine pictorial framework, these studies. One of the few exceptions, of course, is Saint Teresa of Avila. We see any women writing, it's like Saint Teresa. Women were getting mixed messages in the convents, because, and you see it in the writing of women. Nuns wrote autobiographies called vidas, and in the autobiographies, they start off by saying, I shouldn't be prideful, but I can't control myself, and then they write. So it's like they're not supposed to be intellectuals and write, but they are intellectuals and they write. So there's like this kind of identity crisis, and you see it come out where they feel bad about being prideful, but they're compelled. So this the vidas, the autobiographies, are really interesting. One of my colleagues at UNM writes about these autobiographies, Catherine McKnight. So in any case, so you have this tradition of scholars that's really attached to men in studies. one of the few exceptions. In New Spain, a genre of painting that's unique, also like casts or castas, are nun portraits. Nun portraits seem to really develop in the 18th century, and it's very particular to New Spain. We don't see this anywhere else. And I'm showing you the 3 types of nun portraits. The one on the left is a portrait of a young woman about to enter the convent. Okay, she's a novitiate. She's a bride of Christ. She's dressed like a bride of Christ. She's dressed in the outfit of her convent. This is a painting that would have been commissioned by her family. Because typically when a daughter entered a convent, the family wouldn't see her very often or intermittently, or in some cases ever again, for a very long time. So they would commission. She would go to the convent, start her training, and then before taking her final vows, there would be a big party. And people would be invited to celebrate their daughter entering, because it was a big deal to the families. And this portrait would be commissioned, where it would be installed in the home to have some kind of remembrance of their daughter, and then she would enter the convent. So that's the first kind of portrait painting, which is the really well-known one. There have been books and articles. James Cordova just published a book a few years ago on this first category of nun portraits. It's an excellent book if you're interested in learning more about this. The second type of portrait is a small engraving that is part of those autobiographies nuns write. So very small, very few people would see them. They're in the Vidas. You open it and it's a portrait of the woman who's written this book. And it typically represents her sort of in the bloom of life. She's a community leader. She's a pious Catholic. So it's an idealized representation. And in this case, that's where you see women as scholars or as pious Christians. For example, in the one that I'm showing you here, she's standing in front of a desk surrounded by books. She's holding a document. She's some kind of leader. She's a community leader. Okay, and these are small engravings in the books. Okay, keep that in mind. The third class are death portraits. It's a very common tradition. We see this in Europe. It's definitely in Mexico. Later when photography comes in, there are photographs of dead children and dead family members. This is before photography. We see this in painting. When a member of the convent passes away, her sisters would commission the production of a death portrait to keep in the convent after their sister is buried. So these are the main portrait types. So when you think about these being the main types of portraits of nuns, and you think about Miguel Cabrera, he's doing something different. These are just 2 examples of the brides of Christ, just to kind of, since this is the most studied type of portrait. José de Alcíbar is one of the superstars of the late 18th century. That's the one I showed you a little while ago. The one on the right, also by him, he painted both of these. Sor Maria Manuela. Very different convent cultures. One seems more austere, and humble. The other one's more luxurious. This kind of exemplifies the different cultures of convents, but the kinds of portraits that would have been commissioned by family members to keep in the home once their daughters or sisters entered the convent. When you look at Miguel Cabrera's, it's most similar to the second type of portrait, which ordinarily would be a print in a book. Here what he's done is he's monumentalized the figure in a large-scale painting. He's really doing something new. He's really doing something different.
Are those engravings on wood or are they etched?
They're engraved.
And then made?
Yeah, they're engraved on wood. And they're really small images. Yeah. It's just straight up like engraving, intaglio, printmaking. Yeah. And an interesting detail that kind of reinforces sort of his glorification of this Creole intellectual right at this moment in time is what's called the escudo. Escudo means shield. It's that medallion that we see in some of the nun portraits. The escudo de monja. Escudo de monja, which is something, they didn't wear this every day. It's like a ritual kind of element, or they're usually worn, like we see them in the portraits. And they're devotional images associated with that convent. And this one depicts the Annunciation. This is where Mary, following a Northern European model, is usually depicted reading a prayer book, and the angel appears and disturbs her. Okay, that's what we see. Here's a close-up of that detail. And here she is next to a painting by one of her contemporaries, Cristóbal de Villalpando, from the late 17th century. So it's like a colonial version of the Annunciation, painted by someone she knew. And then I want us to kind of think of her. And I'm writing an article on this, and I'm suggesting that what Cabrera is very clever. What he's doing is he is recreating the Annunciation and implicates us in the reading. where we're like the angel, where she's been reading, and we walk in and disturb her. And by doing so, we're kind of reinforcing sort of the significance of this historical figure. You know, it's like she's recreating the Annunciation. It's like an echo. It's like something that I'm arguing in this article, which I probably shouldn't have said. Later, because someone's going to like quote me, but it hasn't come out yet. No, it's okay. No, but do you see what I'm saying? It's like a quote. Yeah, it's like we're walking in because there's text. You know, she's always described as unique, as special. You know, and it's almost comparable to the way people talk about the Virgin as chosen among men. You know, so her unique status is something that's always brought forth. So it makes sense to me that what he's doing is he's kind of recreating the same kind of interaction that we see in the Annunciation, where we're like the angel, where we walk up, and by us engaging the painting, we're reenacting that and thus reinforcing.
And thus
Yeah.
making her
Yeah.
equal to.
Yeah, yeah. And she's looking right at you.
I understand that this is the escudo.
Mhm.
Is the size larger than what would have been real in order for us to see the painting?
No, this is how big they were. They're huge.
Or something that large?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of them have tortoise. They're really exquisite objects. Some of them are embroidered. Some of them are actual paintings. Some of the big painters, like Juan Correa, painted escudos. Yeah, yeah. And typically it's like a ritual kind of element, or you see it in the portraits. It's not something they wore daily.
That she would have chosen this escudo?
Yeah, each convent has a devotional image. It's like a devotional image associated with the convent or the nun.
Would have had the same one?
Yeah. So South America, I'm almost out of time. Excuse me. I really apologize for my cough. I'd like to find that guy who was coughing at me. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of South American art, there was another painting that we wanted to include, but it was impossible to get a response from the Jesuit church where it's located, so it got taken out. So the only image that we have from South America, so we're looking at Peru now, down in South America. We're specifically looking, let's see, where are we? There's Cusco and Lima, okay, and a little bit south where the lake is located. We find these kinds of images, okay? This is known as the Master of Calamarca. Okay, so we don't know the precise identity of the artist, but given sort of the formal characteristics, it's related to the work produced by artists in this area. La Paz School, today what's like La Paz, Bolivia, a little further south of Lima and Cusco. The angel with arquebus, Asiel Timorde, which is Latin for means Asiel fears God, is one of the archangels from I think it's from the Book of Enoch. From the Judaic tradition, 17th century, all on canvas gold. And clearly the artist is looking at the European tradition of representations of archangels, but then he does something different with them. This is what makes it really unique and local. One of the things I want to add as I continue talking about this, that one of the things that's different about colonial painting in South America, especially this region of South America and Peru, we see a lot of gold added to the surface of painting. You know, there's a distinction. We don't see the same kind of thing in New Spain. In South America, we see not only like gold leaf applied to the surface of painting, but actually we see gold objects. Like there are Virgin paintings that have actual gold crowns attached to the surface. Before Rauschenberg, we have combine paintings. You know, they attach things to the surface. And one of the suggestions has been that that this is like an indigenous aesthetic, because we find that before the Spanish arrived to Peru, there seems to have been this sort of perception of sacredness in reflections. So we find tunics made out of gold that reflect light, pools of water that reflect light. So this idea of reflected light seems to be associated with sacredness or the divine to indigenous individuals. And this interest in reflective surfaces seems to kind of survive in this context, since we know that most of these artists were native or possibly mestizo. You know, so this interest in reflective surfaces and the use of gold it has been associated by some scholars to that indigenous aesthetic. The probable sources, again, apocryphal, angels from the Book of Enoch, pre-Hispanic winged warriors. It's also been suggested that this might have another indigenous kind of idea circulating, that of these winged kind of warriors or guardians. We know that like the rifle and the poses come from these military illustrations from Jacob de Gain's Exercise in Arms. So we found the sources and we see the exact illustrations some of these paintings were based on. And then the clothing is drawn from contemporary noble indigenous dress. This is how noble natives in the 17th and 18th century dressed. Okay, so these are the main sources for this type of painting.
Put an angel in an Armani suit.
Yeah, kind of. So here's an example of one of these archangels. This is Peter Paul Rubens, Lucifer and the Rebellious Angels, 1622. You know, very militaristic with armor and weapons. Okay, so there's already a European tradition. The church had, I guess they outlawed the representation of these kinds of angels, but the artists in Peru ignored that and continued to produce them, which is an interesting kind of conflict there or deviation. Here's one of the illustrations from that Degain manual, kind of showing a soldier in uniform holding the rifle. This was clearly one of the models. This is what I was talking about, how artists in the colonial context kind of mixed and matched things freely in a very creative way, in ways that you couldn't see in Europe in most cases. And the clothing is very complicated. This is a diagram I found, kind of identifying each item of clothing. And this is the kind of clothing that noble indigenous people wore during the colonial period. So everything's identified. You know, the jacket, the sleeves, the undercoat, the stockings, the pants, the shoes, the ribbons. And then finally, I mentioned how, and I'm sorry to rush through this, but I don't have a lot of time left, but I mentioned how there is no architecture in the colonial section, although architecture is very important. So I was glad when Rebecca Stone at least added in the indigenous section what are the remains of the Inca temple, the Coricancha, because on top of what was the foundation of that temple is a Catholic church, the Church of Santo Domingo. So you teach this in the indigenous section, but you can also bring it into the colonial section to talk about architecture. And because this is much earlier, I mean, the Inca stone building is renowned. You know, they built these really solid structures out of stone. Some of these are monumental in size. And this is known to have been the location for what was the Coricancha, or the primary Inca temple dedicated to their sun god. Okay? And descriptions of the original Inca temple are quite stunning. They describe the temple as being covered in gold. The walls were covered in gold. Of course, all of this gold was removed, and the building was eventually torn down. And then they built this church. It's the church or convent of Santo Domingo in Cusco, which was the capital of the Inca Empire. So now we have like this kind of hybrid building, you know, very different architectural sensibilities kind of just smashed together. You have this kind of Catholic church that is reminiscent, you know, of European architectural design for churches, you know, kind of placed right on top of this base that was originally for the Inca temple. And what's interesting about this is that we have a church on top of what was already a sacred space. And we find that the Spanish do this a lot in the colonial period, and it seems to be an extension of the Reconquest that happened in Spain when the Muslims were kicked out, in that when the Muslims were expelled, Catholics reused pre-existing mosque sites. They either repurposed mosques into Catholic churches, or they tore down mosques and built Catholic churches on the very same sites. They do the same thing in the Americas. For example, in central Mexico, a lot of the churches are built on sites where there were temples. They knock down the temples and build the mission churches. You know, in some cases you can see the pedestal and the pyramid. The church is on top of that.
I linked that to even the Parthenon.
Yeah.
The Parthenon was converted to a Christian church, and
Yeah.
the mosque was built in the middle, and then
Yeah, and Hagia Sophia as well.
taken
Yeah.
by exactly.
Yeah, and so like this architectural structure, I don't know if Rebecca really goes into that detail, but it's a great way to kind of bring in these other works into some kind of comparative analysis. Yeah. So the Spanish did this in the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquest, and they do this in the Americas again. So this is like a pattern of colonization where they maintain the same sort of valences, symbolic valences of spaces. Yeah.
Is it all like a way to pacify the local? Like, I wonder if they said, and this is still I mean, obviously
Yeah.
many of them would see
Yeah.
it as offensive, but this is also religious.
It's
This is
yeah.
continually a sacred
Yeah,
space.
that line of thought I think is correct. It's along those lines, yeah. They're preserving the same valences in the space that were there before. It's like what happened in Mexico City. The Aztec main temple is torn down, and the same material from the temple is used to build the foundations for the new cathedral right next to it. So it's in the same location, made out of the same material. You know, there's like a strategy at work there.
Could we make the same connection with Rome and the Basilica Constantine?
Sure.
becoming
Yeah.
The emperor being replaced with Rome?
Yeah, there are multiple examples throughout history around the world that can be compared to this. Yeah, so I know Rebecca's interest is primarily in the base. What are the remains of the temple? But from a colonial perspective, we can bring in these other questions, which really sound really interesting to me. I think the students might find that of interest. Yeah. So I think that's it. Are there any comments or questions? I know I threw a lot of information, and the South American material was really quick towards the end. But
I can't believe you got through it. That's amazing.
good, good.
So deep while still getting through everything. That's amazing.
Yeah, if you're interested in sources, if you want to know like sources for particular works or subjects, please feel free to contact me, and I can send you names.
That Lou would put on the website.
Okay.
You
Yeah,
have
if you can put this up on the
Sorry.
website too, yeah, as well as the video, so they can look through this.
The
Yeah,
presentation.
yeah, you can put that on the website as well.
If you have, if any of those books are written
Yeah.
somewhere, he could just put that up there. too.
Okay. Yeah, I'll give him that information so he can post that as well. There's like a lot of scholarship written on, some subjects are more explored in depth than others, but like portraits has a lot of work, non-portraits, I just mentioned James Cordova's book, which I recommend, for the Virgin, yeah.
Say again the name of your book.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of a long title. It's based in the mid-19th century, because what I'm interested in is historiography, that is how did the study of colonial art history begin? And it's tied to early national politics in Mexico City after independence, and it's anchored to the Academy. That's where all this happens. So the name of my book is The Academy of San Carlos and Mexican Art History. There's a subtitle. Okay, so The Academy of San Carlos and Mexican Art History, and the subtitle is Politics, History, and Art in 19th Century Mexico. It's all political.
Okay, so say the subtitle again.
No, Politics, History, and Art in 19th Century Mexico. So yeah, so I'll have Lou post all this information for you on the website. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me. You can get my information from him.
Well, I don't know if you heard this, Ray, but the reading, we've made the readers across the nation aware. Were you in here when I said that? Aware of this website?
Hmm.
And truly, before I even finished giving them the website, there were people who ran to grab their computers and begin to use the resource. And then there were people who stood up and said, why aren't our states doing this? Why aren't our universities doing
Yeah.
this? They were going to go home and make contacts. So
Yeah.
yes, you'll help the people in Utah,
Yeah.
but everyone else will also have access and start to
Good.
think about and use what you've
Yeah.
given us.
No, I'm hoping. And if people have any questions, anybody can contact me. And I'll do my best to direct you to sources or answer your questions. Yes.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, this still kind of like moves toward pulling the European art influence type of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, like, did all the indigenous style of art just die out with the European?
No, you see indigenous elements in these works.
They're there,
Yeah,
but it
they
kinda
get
like-
reconfigured.
It kind of more.
Some things do die out. I mean, there's some things that, like feather painting, which was big in the 16th century. By the end of the 16th century, it just, and as we start moving in the 17th century, it just disappears. There's no equivalent, art form from the European perspective, and it's not considered art from a European point of view. So, like feather painting, eventually does die out. And there are very, very few examples. It's very fragile material. There are very few examples. I think there was one feather painting found in a paper bag rolled up in someone's attic, like a couple years ago, and it turned out to be an authentic 16th century feather painting that was actually in decent shape, surprisingly. So there are very few examples, but like feather painting died out. The manuscript, the indigenous manuscript tradition dies out. All the manuscripts continue to be produced throughout the colonial period along with European books and whatnot. And one interesting thing is in the 17th century, some indigenous produce these codices emulating their idea. They make these codices look, they archaize it. They're brand new, but they're making them look old because they have claims for land ownership and whatnot. So they create codices and then they say that they're ancient. So it's an interesting body. They're called the Techialoyan codices because they're made in the 17th century, but they're made to look like how they think the 16th century codices look like because they're arguing, for land rights. That's an interesting body, So it's interesting to see what they think the old manuscripts look like. Yeah, and what's interesting about the Spanish is that at least early on in the 17th, I think this continues through most of the colonial period, they actually accepted indigenous documents in court cases as testimony. Yeah, if neighbors are fighting over property and one of them has an indigenous map, the court accepted it as testimony, as truth.
So did they get
Yeah.
forgers?
Oh, of course. Just think of all the problems. Yeah. Yeah, they get sneaky and change things or make things up. But to me, it's a fascinating thing that the Spanish courts accept indigenous documents. It's like, what? It's the Spanish colonial period is really fascinating for a number of reasons. But when we talk about the indigenous presence, I mean, they, in spite of the oppressive nature, I mean, this was oppressive for natives in numerous ways. I mean, there was a space for natives in colonial society, and they were integrated in a way that we don't see in the British colonial context. Yeah. And so that's one of the characteristics of the Spanish colonial period is the integration of native presences, but also the diversity. Given the global nature of the empire, we're working with the diversity of the population, and also the cities. The city is also a fundamental characteristic of Spanish. If you're going to have this huge territory, you need huge administrative centers to properly govern these expansive territories and the millions of people living there. So the city becomes very, very important in the Spanish colonial context. A lot of people don't think about that. I think people get sort of confused by the third worldification of what we think of exists south of the border. And another thing to keep in mind is that the United States, the division between the US and Latin America, to me is a problem because US is part of Latin America. I'm sorry, but a third of the United States was part of Mexico and New Spain, and now with immigration, the population is growing, and the separation to me is a problem that people are still holding on to, these divisions. So there are a lot of questions that come up when we look at this material that problematize or question certain things that people are invested in, and I think that's one of the reasons, among all the others that we talked about, why this material it tends to be marginalized. People don't want to look at it. They don't think it's important. They don't understand it. People just don't know. Like I said, with a lot of my colleagues in art history, it's not that I saw aggressive resistance, but lack of interest. It doesn't even register on the radar to them as significant enough for canonical art history. And this is why I was saying earlier that if we really want to globalize this course, we can't continue to reinforce that old, tired Hegelian teleology, starting with prehistory and the ancient Near East, Egypt, Greece, Rome. It's riddled with problems. You wind up having Stockstad, where you have the main narrative and things just glommed on in ghettoized form that have nothing to do with the master narrative. We need to kind of deconstruct that central narrative and reconstruct it if we want to do it in a global perspective. But it's difficult. There's no ideal way to do it. But I think it's worth pursuing if you want to give equal time to other groups and other cultures and their art forms. The thing for me is, like, if something was made, it's important. So why was it made? Why does it look like this? How was it used? What can that tell us about that society or that period? And those to me are the interesting questions. But that means that we're going to have to kind of start moving away from the traditional sort of ideas of European aesthetics and all of the criteria that inform how art history as a discipline traditionally has functioned or practiced.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you.